All right.
Internet is dodgy. Yeah. Internet is unreliable up here. But anyway, where I was, so Christianity is very much founded on Daniel and the Book of Enoch. People forget like how much the Book of Enoch is a foundational scripture for Christianity, because that scripture wasn't preserved in what we now call the Old Testament. So people forget that that was actually an important one. But Daniel's another really important one, and that did get into the Old Testament, the later Old Testament, that so declared, because it claims, or Christians claimed that it would predict the Messiah, their Messiah. You know, they think they see Jesus in Daniel 9, and that is not what the book originally meant. The original authors of Daniel 9 meant a completely different person. They were their Messiah, their anointed one, that they talk about as dying, being killed, is Onias III, who was high priest of the Jewish temple in 171. He was killed in 171 BC. And so this Daniel was written as propaganda. We have tons of evidence for this, and I cover it all in the article. If people want to go into it, we might get into some of the details today. It's obvious that whoever wrote this sort of created it as like a forgery so that people think that this is an ancient prophetic text that predicted their victory against Antiochus in the civil war, the rebellion, the Jewish rebellion against their Greek overlords. And part of this storyline was the killing of Onias, who was a very revered, almost saintly-like figure. So his assassination was like the thing, the match that lit the fire, basically. It's like that really, like, that's it, we're done here. And so they used that as to motivate people. So they sort of made it look like Daniel, this prophet, had hundreds of years ago predicted that Onias would be assassinated, and predicted that soon after God would come and vanquish their enemies and paradise would reign on earth, kind of thing. So that was what they wrote it for originally. And that explains some of the weird details in it. Like Daniel 9 has some very convoluted, strange mathematics in it. And that the Onias thing, trying to make it fit Onias is the reason for that. But when it failed, like it predicted, the end of the world was coming, paradise would come, and it didn't come. Now they won the war. So that there was a partial success, but the prophecy still did not, the rest of the prophecy wasn't fulfilled. So what happens when prophecies fail? All the time, all religions, they don't abandon the prophecy. They don't declare it false. No, they reinterpret it, right? They say, well, it must have meant something else. And so then they reinterpret it as referring to some other future Messiah. And we have examples in the Dead Sea Scrolls and various other places of where all these Jewish sects were trying to figure out what the real prediction was, right? Now, the reality is that there was never any intended prediction beyond this, right? It was only intended for the war. The Maccabean War is only intended for refer to Onias and so on, but continuing to try and make the Bible code work for them to try and find a new Messiah. Lots of groups were doing this, and they were trying to figure out what date would fit. And one of the best fits, like the easiest way to do it, is the 30s AD, which actually is what the Christians did, right? They said that's we can make the math work. The 30s AD, our guy died in 30s AD, therefore we have the real guy. Our guy is the Messiah who was predicted, right?
Is this like pin the tail on the donkey, kind of, sort of?
With no actual donkey, but you claim that there's a donkey there, and then you pin the tail on and say that's where the tail goes, right? Okay. It's more like that. And the funny thing is, I did a whole video for people who want like some sort of humorous and educational backstory on this for Wichita, and I've talked about this before, but in my Wichita talk, when Harold Camping predicted the end of the world, and it was called Rapture Day, right? Like it was going to be the end of the world. On Rapture Day, Wichita, the atheist group in Wichita, had me come out and give a speech on Doomsday, and my speech was "You're all going to die," and so if you Google "You're all going to die," maybe "We're all going to die." I think it was "You're all going to die," but anyway, it doesn't matter. You'll find it. Wichita. Rapture Day talk. And I go into how the Jews kept trying to predict the end of the world and failing repeatedly, and that this process led to Christianity. Christianity was caused by this. So it started with Jeremiah. That's a classic example of the origin of cognitive dissonance theory. Yeah, for the study of prophets. The same thing, right? When prophecy fails, they just reinterpret it. They get stronger belief rather than running away or giving up on it, right? So contrary to intuition, I think is the thing there. But it started with Jeremiah. Jeremiah had a prediction about when the exile would end. The prediction was failed. It didn't come true. The exile ended earlier than he claimed it would. And so in Daniel 9, you see the first thing that happens is Daniel is begging God to explain how did you let Jeremiah get it wrong? What's going on? I don't understand. And then Gabriel comes down and says, let me tell you the secret. And then he like reinterprets Jeremiah's prophecy. So it's a failed prophecy being reinterpreted. And of course, it conveniently works out to be Onias. He was actually predicting Onias, yada, yada, and the victory over the Antiochenes and so on. And so that was the Seleucids, so the victory over the Seleucids. So it was predicting all of that. Then that prophecy failed because it predicted various things would happen that didn't happen. The end of the world didn't come, etc. So then the attempts to reinterpret the reinterpretation of the failed prophecy, so it's got multiple failed prophecies, multiple failed reinterpretations. That eventually ended up creating Christianity. So Christianity is actually a product of, it's another attempt to fix a broken, failed prophecy. And so that's why Daniel is really important. They need that to be true, because if Daniel's a forgery, then the whole basis originally for Christianity kind of goes away. Like it also like creates the problem that if you're admitting that Christianity was started by a forgery, and if you're admitting that Christians revere a book that has forgeries in it, that undermines the whole religion, because it's, well, what else is unreliable? What else is fallible? What else is a human creation in this? So Christians really desperately need their word.
You also bring up like Maccabees wholeheartedly supports Daniel as if it's authentic. So now you've got
and it's the first, right, and that's the first time we hear of the book outside of the book, right? So it's conveniently right. It's created by propaganda for the Maccabees, and then immediately in Maccabean propaganda literature, they're plugging the book, right? So it's like, it's like social media. It's like, okay, we've created our fake news now. Let's promote the fake news in our other channels. Basically, is what's going on there. Wow. So that's the role of that. So that's the impact of it. And then of course you get into the evidence as to how we know this. How did we figure this out, basically? And it is the mainstream view. I have to say, like, that's why I say how we know rather than is, because the mainstream consensus is solidly on this. Like, only fundamentalists, only literalists, only desperate, hardcore believing Christians are against this conclusion. All the mainstream scholars, all the mainstream literature, all the mainstream commentaries and the academic peer-reviewed commentaries, they all agree it's a forgery. The evidence is overwhelming in this case. So it's one of the clearest cases we have.
Interesting. Look, you go through so much detail, and I took lots of notes because I said, there's no way I'll remember to actually go into some of these things and to have you maybe elaborate. Mm-hmm. For those who haven't read his article, maybe it'll be good to have you kind of touch on some of these details. I really recommend they go read it, but if they just don't go read it, at least they can see this and actually know what the arguments are for Daniel being a forgery. The first thing I'd like to ask, though, number one, let's start with the Jeremiah thing real quick. You did mention that he had a 70-year prophecy. This is happening back during the exile time, that, hey, after 70 years, you'll come back into the land. This is the idea, or at least God's going to keep his promise and do these things.
Yeah.
However, according to this logic, it takes to the 2nd century BC to kind of backdate and say, we're fixing this problem because for hundreds of years, this hasn't fulfilled. So they're correcting a failed prophet named Jeremiah. Yeah. And they're keeping him as their good. We got to keep Jeremiah on our side.
Yeah.
Even though Jeremiah is fighting with other prophets during his own time.
Yeah.
And these guys get killed by the Babylonians because he's saying, look, and I just did this with Dr. Kip recently, Dr. Kip Davis. He said, look, Jeremiah is like talking about these false prophets. They're talking about, we're going back to the land. And Jeremiah is saying, plant your vineyard. Do not try and mess with these dudes. Sure enough, whichever prophet, I guess, was on the right side of history, just like Josephus, they're the right guys. They're the guys you thumbs up because they're the ones who are correct. It's like a guessing game. But anyway, Daniel's fixing this problem. Daniel fixes, and he thinks the world's going to end in his day, or at least something's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's who are we talking about? The fictional character or the authors? I think the authors didn't really believe that the end was going to transpire. They wanted people to believe that. Like, that's how you inspire people to war, to fight harder and so on. So they definitely wanted people to believe that, but they obviously knew they were lying. They were making this up. So it wasn't like they thought that this was a genuine rescue of the Jeremiah prophecy. And they might have thought that maybe the Jeremiah prophecy could be rescued this way. And then they just inferred rather than knew what that meant, right? And so the rest is like, well, we think it's going to be this, but we're going to sell it as a vision from the angel Gabriel.